Starting off our list in our number 10 spot, we have Warren G. Hooper. Warren G. Hooper was a 40-year-old state senator in Michigan. In this state in the 1940s, political corruption was a huge problem, and it was quite common for politicians and legislators to accept bribes in exchange for votes. After Warren confessed to accepting a $500 bribe for his vote on a horse racing bill, he was offered immunity if he testified as a witness in front of a grand jury. On January 11th of 1945, just a few days before his testimony was scheduled, Warren was driving to his home but never made it there. His car was found in flames shortly after on the side of the road, and the body of Warren was found in the front seat with 3 bullet holes found in his head. To make matters more suspicious, there were 2 other witnesses who were also supposed to testify in the same case, and they were both also found dead under suspicious circumstances as well. This is when a gang called the Purple Hill Gang began to come into the investigation. The Purple Hill Gang was a group that really controlled Detroit during the 1920s and 30s. There were rumors swirling that a former state treasurer named Frank McKay, who was under investigation in this grand jury case, was behind the killings of the witnesses, including Warren's. It was believed that Frank had bribed a deputy warden to temporarily release 2 of the imprisoned Purple Hill Gang leaders so that they could commit the horrible crime against Warren and then promptly return to the jail, which would give them a pretty solid alibi. 4 former members of the Purple Hill Gang did end up getting charged with conspiracy to commit murder because of the testimony of an informant that they had once approached him and asked him to take Warren's life. And while the 4 were convicted, they received quite short sentences, and one of the convictions was even later overturned. In our number 9 spot today, we have Michael Mansfield. Michael was a 19-year-old student at Lincoln College in Illinois, and he lived with another student named Russell Smrekar. Russell ended up being expelled from the school after being charged with burglary for stealing a guitar and some record albums from another dorm room. After his theft, he had given the stolen albums to Michael, and in order to avoid being charged with possession of stolen property, Michael agreed to testify against Russell. This took place in 1975, and on New Year's Eve of that year, Michael was spending the holiday at his parents' house when he told them he was headed out to see a friend. Unfortunately, Michael was never seen again after this night, and of course, because of the loss of the witness, the charges were dropped against Russell. Although extremely suspicious, this alone of course didn't mean that Russell had anything to do with Michael's disappearance, but just you wait. In our number 8 spot today, we have Ruth Martin. Okay, you thought I was gonna leave you hanging with the last one, but I promise you that I am not. Shortly after Michael's disappearance that we just talked about, that same creep Russell was charged with stealing 3 steaks that totaled to $4 from a local grocery store. The witnesses to this crime were Jay Fry, who was a produce manager at the store, as well as a woman named Ruth Martin who had seen Russell toss the steaks into his car after stealing them. Both Jay and Ruth were called to testify as witnesses, but on June 2nd, 1976, Ruth went missing and her abandoned car was later found with blood inside. 3 months after this, Russell broke into Jay's home and shot both Jay and his wife, which took both of their lives. He was caught for this crime and was sentenced to 300 years in prison. Okay, so what does this have to do with Michael and Ruth? Well, no one knew what happened to either of them until 10 years ago in 2011. Russell became terminally ill in jail and decided that then was the time for him to make some deathbed confessions, and he confessed to taking both of their lives as well. Unfortunately, neither of the bodies have ever been found, but it is absolutely insane to think that 4 innocent lives were taken over some stolen records and $4 worth of steaks. In our number 7 spot today, we have David Kelly. David was a nuclear scientist and weapons expert. In 2003, he had an off-the-record conversation with a BBC journalist in which he explained that the dossier that the UK government had created in reference to Iraq's nuclear weapons capabilities was actually falsified. Despite this being off the record, the conversation was reported widely and ended up coming back onto David. Just a few weeks after this, David went for a walk in the woods near his home, but he never returned. Of course, search parties were sent out to look for him after his family was worried when he didn't return, and he was later found dead, but the circumstances were quite mysterious. Just a small trigger warning before heading into this next part, as it was ruled that he did take his own life. It is said that David had taken coproximol, which is a painkiller, and that he had also severed severed his ulnar artery in his left wrist with a pruning knife that he had since he was young. This is obviously horrific, but not necessarily the most suspicious thing, but here's where things get weird. Firstly, those who spoke to David that day explained that he seemed to be tired but was in good spirits, and despite being in a bit of trouble, he received a lot of support for his honesty. The weirdest thing is that neither the blister pack for the painkillers or the knife had his fingerprints on them. There were no fingerprints on them, which would suggest that the items had been wiped clean, which certainly would be very bizarre. Despite it officially being declared personally inflicted, many people believe that foul play was much more likely. In our number 6 spot today we have Mauro de Moro. Moreau was an Italian investigative journalist, and it is said that his profession is most likely what led to his disappearance. On the evening of September 16, 1970, he was coming back home from work but never actually returned. Before his disappearance, he apparently was convinced that he had the story of a lifetime, and he had even told his coworkers that he had a story that was going to shake Italy. There are 3 main speculations and theories about what this story might have been and what could have happened to him. One theory is that the story could have been related to the death of a man named ENRIQUE, who was the president of Italy's state-owned oil and gas conglomerate ENI. The next was that his story could have been about finding a drug trafficking network between Sicily and the United States, and the final theory is that his disappearance might have been related to a failed right-wing coup that took place in the 70s. Despite extensive searches, he has never been found, and in fact 2 of the main detectives who started the case both had their lives taken by the mafia. It is believed that he was the victim of what is called a lupara bianca, which is a journalistic term for when the mafia takes the life of someone in such a way that their body will never be found. Whatever story he was working on, we'll likely never know, and it's such a tragedy that his job he was so passionate about is what most likely led to his disappearance. In our number 5 spot today we have Henry Baltimore Jr. In 1973, Henry was a 21-year-old honors student at the University of Michigan who had a very promising future ahead of him. In March of that year, Henry was unfortunately attacked inside of his apartment. 2 men broke in and tied him to the bed before stealing both money and material items. Henry was reluctant to report this incident to the police but did end up doing so. After this, a suspect named Roy Davis was arrested and charged with armed robbery, and Henry was scheduled to testify at his hearing but never showed up. 2 days after the hearing, Henry did resurface and asked the prosecutors to drop the charges because he was really frightened, but they refused and Henry was rescheduled to testify. 2 days before this rescheduled hearing, Henry ended up disappearing very suspiciously. Originally, people believed that he may have gone into hiding considering how vocal he was about being frightened, but that belief quickly went away and people began to suspect something a lot more sinister was at play. Henry's family especially knew something was wrong because there was no way he would disappear without telling at least one of them. Without Henry and his testimony, Roy ended up taking a plea deal and only was sentenced to 6 weeks. Roy was of course considered a person of interest in Henry's disappearance, and a neighbor of Henry's even said that they saw Roy and another man knocking on Henry's door the day that he disappeared, but Roy's mother offered her son an alibi, so Roy has never been formally charged for the disappearance. The 2 theories of what happened to Henry are either that someone abducted and took the life of him to prevent him from testifying, or Henry left Michigan, changed his identity, and assumed a different name. You would have hoped if it was the latter he would have at least told one member of his family. His case remains open almost 50 years later, and who knows? If someone out there who's watching this video knows something about this case, please call in and give any and all information over to the authorities. The remaining family members of Henry's deserve to know what happened to him. In our number 4 spot today we have LENA CHAPIN. If you're a fan of the show Unsolved Mysteries, this might be one you've already heard of. LENA and her 5 sisters were constantly moved around growing up depending on who their mother, Sandy, was seeing and where the new boyfriend or husband lived. Shortly before becoming a teenager, LENA and her family moved onto a farm owned by their 3rd stepfather, Gary. Gary apparently was actually quite a good stepfather and was quite kind to the girls, but after a few years, Sandy began to have an affair with a local 21-year-old, as well as writing bad checks on Gary's bank account. When Gary learned of this, he of course talked to a lawyer lawyer about a divorce, and shortly after this, Gary disappeared. Flash forward years later when Lena is 17, after keeping a horrible secret for all of those years and being filled with guilt, she comes forward to Gary's brother to tell him that she knows what happened to Gary. Lena explains that her mother Sandy had actually taken his life, burned his body, and made Lena help clean up the scene and all of the evidence, and then they drove down a country road and threw his bones out of the window. Unknowingly to Lena, Gary's brother Albert was actually recording this whole confession, which he of course hands over to the police. Now that the police are confronting Lena and her mother Sandy about this confession, since Lena is 17 and Sandy is still her legal guardian, Sandy convinces Lena to walk back her confession, and since it was recorded without her knowledge, it isn't admissible evidence. A few more years go by and Lena doesn't speak of the crime again and ends up getting a job, having a baby, and she lives with her boyfriend, and then right before turning 21 years old, which would make her of legal age to testify against her mother in court, she just disappears. Everyone in the family, especially her sisters, are convinced this disappearance has everything to do with her mother Sandy and was done to keep her quiet. While this mystery is still unsolved, it's extremely likely we all already know what happened to Lena, but we just need the evidence to prove it. In our number 3 spot today we have Oliver Munson. In January of 1983, a teacher from Baltimore named Oliver Munson purchased a used vehicle. Just a couple months later, Oliver was surprised to find out that the vehicle he purchased was actually stolen, and that the man who he purchased it from, named Dennis Watson, was actually the leader of an auto theft ring. Oliver of course had no idea about this dark history and agreed to testify against Dennis in court. Flash forward to February of 1984, just 3 days before Oliver is meant to testify against Dennis. Oliver leaves his home for work in the morning but never shows up at the school and ends up never being seen again. 3 days after he disappeared, his car was found 2 blocks away from his home with a flat tire, and shortly after this discovery, a stolen vehicle was discovered that had traces of blood in it, as well as a spent casing from a bullet. This vehicle also contained 2 receipts from a video store that had Oliver's name on them, which of course led authorities to believe he had been abducted and killed in order to prevent him from testifying. Unfortunately, because of lack of evidence, Dennis was never charged, and Oliver has never actually been found. This whole thing is of course so tragic, as Oliver was most likely a completely innocent party. In our number 2 spot today we have Clinton Glenn. Okay, I'm sensing a trend here. Apparently people who abduct and take the lives of people to stop them from testifying don't usually do that just once. Previous to Oliver, who we just talked about, Dennis had another shady happening in reference to a witness testifying against him. In 1973, a 29-year-old man named Clinton Glenn was scheduled to testify against Dennis at an armed robbery trial. The day before this testimony, Clinton was unfortunately found burned to death in a car that belonged to none other than Dennis. Dennis did end up getting indicted for this crime after another witness came forward, and we were so close to seeing some real justice, but the case ended up being dropped after this other witness died of a suspicious overdose. At some point you'd think all of this would end up getting Dennis charged and convicted with all 3 witnesses' deaths, but of course this is all circumstantial evidence, and it would be terrible to have seen him be acquitted of these crimes due to there not being enough evidence to pin him at the scene. To end off these horrible stories on an extremely creepy note, Dennis was convicted of auto theft and received a 10-year sentence, but after being paroled in 1989, he kind of just fell off the map and his whereabouts have been unclear since then. In our number 1 spot today we have Karen Silkwood. Karen Silkwood is well known for the worst reasons. She was an American chemical technician and a labor union activist who was very vocal and often raised concerns about the corporate practices that related to the health and safety of those working in a nuclear facility. You would think this is something that all of those working in the field would be concerned about, but apparently not. She worked a job making plutonium pellets and was the first woman on the union's negotiating team, and after she testified to the Atomic Energy Commission about the things she was concerned about, it was discovered that she had plutonium contamination on both herself and in her home. Plutonium isn't an issue outside of the body, but can easily be ingested or inhaled, which is when it creates a major problem for humans. Karen was driving to meet with a New York Times journalist and an official of her union's national office after deciding to go public with some of her findings, and the people who saw her right before she left for this meeting saw her with a binder full of documentation documentation of her findings. During her trip in her car there, Karen ended up driving off the road and striking a culvert, and this accident took her life. Here's where things get suspicious though. That binder I just mentioned was never found. It was said that Karen had fallen asleep at the wheel and almost twice the recommended dosage of methaqualone was found in her system, but there were clear skid marks on the road which suggested Karen was trying to get the car back straight on the road, and despite the accident being entirely at the front of the car, there was damage to the back of the car that friends and family say wasn't there before, and paint chips were found which would suggest a car had hit her from behind. To make this whole thing even more suspicious, apparently Karen was receiving threats before her passing. There have of course been claims of foul play and claims that she was run off the road by another vehicle, but unfortunately with little evidence these claims have never been able to be proven for sure. But what is for sure is that whatever really happened to Karen, it seems like a simple accident doesn't cover the full truth.
Coming in at number 10 we have Sean Flynn. Even though it seemed that war is just non-stop carnage without any rulebook to slow things down, I mean it might be like that, I've never been there, and like most things in the world, when you're actually part of it, it's mostly very different. And that's not an invitation to take me to war, I never want to go. But what I'm talking about is things like don't kill civilians. They got nothing to do with the conflict. Don't use certain weapons that are considered to be inhumane. And journalists are allowed to work in the area without having to worry about being attacked by the other side. Well, the thing is, it's war and people aren't always going to follow these rules. Now, this guy wasn't a soldier, but he was involved in one of the biggest wars in American history as a photojournalist. He was working in Vietnam documenting everything that was going on, and then him and his fellow journalists were captured by Vietnamese guerrillas. People don't know why they were captured. The Vietnamese forces might have thought they were spies. They might have known that they were journalists, but for whatever reason they were captured. After that, no one knows what happened to them. They might have been taken behind enemy lines and then sold off to other people, or they might have escaped and got lost in the wilderness and passed. But to this day, the fate of those two men is still a mystery. And guys, make sure you hit that like button because it really helps us out. Coming at number 9 we have Enrique Roman Martinez. Back in 2020 on Memorial Day, Enrique Martinez would go missing. His family put out a missing persons claim for him, and for a significant period of time there was nothing found. It would seem that he might have ran away because his family said that he didn't have any enemies and described him as a hippie. Seems like an interesting combination of hippie and soldier, but he just wanted to live a fun life with his family after serving his time in the military. Eventually there would be a discovery made that would help the family know what happened to their son, more in the sense it would let them mourn and have some closure. His head was found in a pier after it washed ashore. This shocked the community where he lived. The problem was that the rest of him was never found, so it was hard to find out what actually happened to him. There was no security footage of what happened to him either, so it's unknown who could have done this to him. It's suspected to be a homicide since his head was removed from the body. Next on the list we have James Van Fleet's troops. Van Fleet was a lifelong military man. He fought in 3 separate wars. Just to have the Constitution to go through that much carnage would be incredible. He was sent over during World War I, World War II, and the Korean War. During the Korean War, he was leading a troop of men into action and then something went horribly wrong. Even though Van Fleet was a skilled soldier who had seen action many times before, for some reason a large percentage of his troops went missing. It's suspected that they might have walked into an ambush, or that some of the men deserted the situation to try and find refuge somewhere they could have been safer. The whole thing is still shrouded in mystery. Coming in at number 7 we have the Fort Hood soldiers. For this we need to head over to Fort Hood, Texas. Now even though I would never want to go to war, I find the whole experience fascinating. There is a massive psychological effect of seeing warfare. There are a few cases where people have been able to walk away from the whole experience without it affecting them very much, but for other people it seems like it sticks with them for a very long time. And then those ongoing effects might stick with your platoon. In Fort Hood, Texas, there has been a series of missing soldiers that people cannot explain. There seems to be something going on over there that is causing people to snap. On 2 separate occasions, people have opened fire on their fellow soldiers, and since then 12 different people have gone missing. Now 2 of them were found, but they were not alive. Could these people be running away from the military because they're finding out that this life is not for them, or is there something that the fort is trying to keep secret and some reason they needed to take people out? No one knows why so many troops have gone missing within the American borders, but it has been raising a lot of suspicions. Next on the list we have BOWE BERGDAHL. BOWE was fighting in the military around 2010. He was over in Iraq, he was serving with his troops, and then out of nowhere he would disappear. There was a search launch for him, but it would seem that he was lost to the world. People thought that he might have been killed in action or that he might have ran away from his post from the stress of being out there, but the answer would actually have been darker than both of those. He would pop up in a Taliban video. He had been taken prisoner by the terrorist organization and was now pleading on the video for his American government to do something to bring him home. Next on the list we have AFLON BAKOWSKI. You think one of the coolest parts of being in the military would be gathering intelligence. If the movies paint the picture accurately, then it would be like going in as a spy to get all the info you need so you can come back with your master plan to save the day. Well, even though we know that's nowhere near the truth, you would hope that things wouldn't go like this. AFLON was doing his reconnaissance for the Americans during the Vietnam War. He was with 7 other people on board a plane that was flying over Laos. For some reason the plane was spotted and they were shot down. This led to a recovery team having to move in and get the men out of there. One of the 7 men was killed in the crash, one of them was taken prisoner, and 4 of them were recovered by the American forces. But no one knows what happened to AFLON. Maybe he was able to make it out when the plane crashed and he thought he could make his own way back. Maybe as the plane was going down he tried to jump out and landed somewhere in the jungle but was never seen again. Or maybe he was taken prisoner and the Laos government never told the Americans about him. To this day, no one knows where he went or what happened to him after that flight. Next on the list we have Shelton Charles E. This was something that I thought was very interesting. You can go missing in war for years and people will have no idea if you're alive or dead, and then you'll just pop up again. During the Vietnam War, Shelton was tasked with doing some flyovers and taking pictures. It sounded like it should have been something fun and relaxing, but I don't think there's anything in the military that is fun and relaxing. And this trip to grab these photos would have been extra stressful. During the flyover, his plane caught fire, and that's pretty damn serious. I don't know if you guys have been on a plane or know that much about aviation, but when you start to see fire when you're up in the sky, there's a good chance that you're done for. Now this plane went down, but he was able to call for rescue before he hit the earth and he survived the crash. Now your boys should have come right for you to save you, but there was weather conditions that made it horrible for them to come in and making it impossible for the men to get there to save their man. It took them 3 days to get through there, and by the time they did, he was gone. Now people didn't know what happened to him. That was until 3 years later when he popped up as a Vietnamese POW. The whole time he was alive and his buddies had no idea where he went. Next on the list we have the missing MILA soldiers. There has been a constant conflict in the country of MILA. The government-run military has been in a battle with the Islamic militants that have been rebelling against the country, and on March 16th the militants attacked a base. It's unsure how they were able to get in and attack with such precision, but they were able to take out 11 men, and now 8 others are missing. It's unknown what could have happened to these 8 men. They might have fled the scene when they realized the base was overrun and they need to get into a better position, or they could have been taken hostage by the militant group. 8 men could be a very strong bargaining chip in future negotiations if it came to that. Next on the list we have SANJIT BHATTACHARJEE. We would like to think that everyone is following the rules of war, but that is sometimes not the case. Sometimes you can be taken away and forgotten about, and that might be what happened to SANJIT. SANJIT was in the Indian Army and he was in charge of patrolling the border between India and Pakistan. Back in April of 1997, him and his platoon were out patrolling and they came back without him and 1 other soldier. Since then, his mother has been petitioning with the Supreme Court to find out what happened to her son. There is a chance that he was killed in action, but there are a number of Indian soldiers that have been taken into the custody of the Pakistani military that the government is denying. Sanjit's mother is sure that her son is one of those soldiers. Even after 24 years, she is still fighting to have her son returned home safely. That is a very good mom. And next we have the missing troops from World War I. World War I was the first majorly mechanized war. You had people on horseback fighting people who had cannons that could devastate a 5 square meter radius. The unbalance of tech was insane, and because of this, some of the battles were brutal. In the Battle of the Somme, there were 300,000 people that died. Over 20,000 people died in 1 day. As you can imagine, when people were storming into the battle, shells were falling out of the sky non-stop. There were a lot of bodies that were unaccounted for. Over 70,000 soldiers went missing during World War I. Now, some of these men might have run away to start a new life in Europe. After they saw the destruction of the war, they might have wanted nothing to do with it. And I can't really blame them. Eventually you realize that this is going to get you killed and you just want to live your life. But there's a good portion of that 70,000 that were killed in action, but their bodies were never found.
Starting off this list in our number 10 spot, we have Dor Bahadur Bista. Dor was a very well-respected anthropologist from Nepal. He was best known for his work with the Takali traders and also for his time as a professor at a university in Nepal. While he was known to go trekking off into the wilderness in order to conduct his research in private, he was, after all, an anthropologist, so he certainly couldn't go totally off the map where there were no other humans at all. In 1995, Dor had published a book and was feeling a little anxious about some of the negative reviews it was getting. Dor was no stranger to criticism or enemies, as many people did not like him due to the fact that he was trying to help empower people who were in a lower class. Before his disappearance, Dor told one of his friends that he was fearing for his safety and that he was considering leaving in order to ensure that nothing bad happened to him. A few weeks after this conversation, somebody saw him boarding a bus, and this was the last time anyone has seen or heard from him. It's obviously very tough to say what happened to him for sure. He had a wife and children who he left behind, and part of me hopes he didn't abandon them, but part of me also hopes he didn't meet some kind of cruel end. I hope that one day someone can figure out what happened and where he went so that his children can be offered some kind of closure. In our number 9 spot today, we have Boris Weisfeiler. Boris Weisfeiler was a Soviet-born mathematician who was living in Pennsylvania. One winter in 1985, he decided to take a nice little trip to southern Chile to do some hiking and escape the bitter cold. Unfortunately, this is where he ended up disappearing. The last time anyone saw or heard from Boris was in January of that year, and not too long after his last sighting, his backpack was found by a river. This discovery had many people speculating that he may have drowned while trying to cross the river, which is just terrible. But since a body has never been found, there are of course people out there who speculate further. Some people out there believe that Boris may have been abducted. Apparently in 2000, there was enough evidence of a kidnapping that 8 different people were actually arrested and charged with the crime. In the end, however, the case was closed due to the statute of limitations, which seems like that shouldn't have been a factor, but I guess it was. This is just one unsolved mystery that I hope one day we find the answers to. In a number 8 spot today, we have ERNST PRIESNER. ERNST PRIESNER was a biologist who was particularly interested in studying pheromones, even more specifically the pheromones of clearwings. His research and studies actually led to the discovery of several new species, and he was able to synthetically create a set of 21 pheromones which was able to attract almost all types of winged bugs. Honestly, I didn't know that this was something that people dedicated their lives to, but it sounds very complicated and kinda cool. In July of 1994, Ernest was collaborating on some research, and he went out to check one of the insect traps that was in the mountains of Garmisch-Partenkirchen, but unfortunately, he never made it back. Search parties were sent out, but no one was ever able to find him, and since he had gone alone, it's not like there was anybody who could testify as to what happened to him. Ernest is sadly still missing today, and I truly hope that one day we find out what happened to him on that day. In our number 7 spot today, we have Natalie Christopher. In August of 2019, an astrophysicist by the name of Natalie Christopher went missing after going out for a run during her visit to a Greek island. Her partner was on the trip with her, and when he awoke one morning, Natalie wasn't in the room anymore. He called her and she stated she was out for a run, which of course is totally normal, but when she didn't return for several hours after, alarm bells definitely began to ring. After contacting authorities, searches began to take place immediately, hoping to find Natalie and bring her home safe. A few days after her disappearance, authorities explained that her cell phone had been switched off. After police, fire, pedestrian, and helicopter searches, Natalie's body was eventually found. She was found in a ravine that was in a rough mountainous area approximately 20 meters deep in the water. After a full inspection of the site and an autopsy, her injuries were consistent with a fall in which she had suffered a head trauma. This is obviously a very tragic ending to this story, but I am at least glad that her loved ones were able to receive some kind of closure for this terrible situation. In our number 6 spot today, we have PENG JIAMU. The Lopner Desert is known for its aggressive massive landscape. It has soft riverbeds and sand dunes that are known to shift. It's definitely not uncommon for an entire hillside to collapse, burying everything underneath it. This brings us to June 17, 1980, when Peng JIAMU, who is a biologist at the Shanghai Institute of Biochemistry and Cell Biology, and some of his colleagues were on an expedition in this desert. That morning, Peng noticed that they were running short on some supplies. He left a note stating that he was heading out to look for water, and he left, but he was never seen again. There was a huge search for him that involved soldiers, helicopters, police, and their dogs, but unfortunately neither Peng or his body have ever been found. Many people believe that he may have been the victim of one of those hillside collapses, but in all honesty, it could have been anything. Other expeditions have come across bodies in this desert, none of which have been Peng so far, but I hope that one day someone is able to find him. In our number 5 spot today, we have Timothy Cunningham. Timothy Cunningham was a Harvard-educated epidemiologist who worked for the Center for Disease Control and Prevention before his disappearance in February of 2018. He was 35 years old at the time and was working on tackling both the Ebola and Zika outbreaks. On February 7th, he resigned from a special deployment team that he was working with. His boss explained that he would have tried to convince him to stay for a few more months, but that Timothy just seemed too ready to move on. Timothy left work on February 12th saying that he was feeling unwell, but a coworker has since explained that this was shortly after Timothy learned that he was being passed over for a promotion. The day before his disappearance, Timothy told his neighbors that they should erase his phone number from their phones. Searches for Timothy went on for almost 2 months, and during this time authorities found 4 separate bodies that did not end up being Timothy's. Eventually though, Timothy's body was found in a river and it was confirmed that he had drowned. After more investigation, it was determined that Timothy had unfortunately taken his own life. People who knew Timothy began to recount some of the struggles he had that could have led to this extremely tragic situation, but I also think it's worth mentioning that there are many people out there who believe some sort of foul play was actually involved and that it may have had to do with his line of work. It is a very sad ending to an already sad story, and I hope Timothy's family has been able to support each other during these undoubtedly difficult years. In our number 4 spot today, we have Percy Fawcett. Percy Fawcett set out in 1925 to search the Amazon jungle for what had yet to be discovered. As an archaeologist and geologist, he was looking for an ancient lost civilization called the Lost City of Z. Percy went on this adventure with his oldest son Jack, one of Jack's friends, and a couple dogs. Unfortunately, after entering the jungle, none of them were ever seen again. No trace was left, and no one has been able to find his body, despite it being almost a full century since he disappeared. Some people believe he may have been lost, perhaps he was injured, maybe he even had some kind of fatal animal encounter, but there are some people who believe he just decided to abandon his life to live a life in the jungle. At the end of the day, his lost city of Z kind of did end up existing, as archaeologists have discovered large stone cities that were hidden in the jungle pretty close to where Percy would have disappeared. It has also happened that many people who went on expeditions in this jungle did not end up making it out, so it's probably best to just stay away from that one. In our number 3 spot today, we have Suzanne EATON. In 2019, an American biologist named Suzanne EATON disappeared while she was in Greece. Suzanne was a scientist and professor at the Max Planck Institute of Molecular Cell Biology and Genetics in Dresden, Germany, but was in Greece at the time of her disappearance for a conference. On July 2nd of 2019, she was last seen playing the piano in the lobby of her hotel before it was believed she went out on a run, which is the last time she was spotted. It was believed for a while that she may have fallen and injured herself or something of that nature. Of course, authorities began a massive search, and it took about a week for them to find anything. On July 8th of that year, Suzanne's body was found in an older World War II bunker, and she unfortunately had been killed. This of course turned the search party into an investigation, which led to a 27-year-old Greek man who did end up confessing to this very terrible crime. In October of 2020, he was tried and found guilty, which then led to him being given a life sentence in prison. Since this terrible day, the Institute of Molecular Biotechnology in Austria has started a memorial fund in Suzanne's honor, which is aimed to support young scientists' endeavors in interdisciplinary topics. I truly think that this is a wonderful way to remember Suzanne. In our number 2 spot today, we have Vladimir Alexandrov. A Soviet physicist by the name of Vladimir Alexandrov made quite a name for himself himself when he came up with the mathematical model for nuclear winter. Nuclear winter is what is hypothesized will happen after large-scale nuclear war and firestorms, and it is the long and severe cooling effect that will happen to our global climate. So yeah, he's an important guy and the concept is just absolutely terrifying. So that's a little bit about Vladimir, and in 1985 he was apparently visiting Madrid when he just up and vanished. No one really knows what happened to him, but there are a couple theories. The first being that since he was in Madrid he might have chosen to abandon his country, which is why he was never heard from again. The second, crazier theory is that there are people who believe that the whole nuclear winter thing might have just been heavily promoted by Russia in order to convince people in the United States to protest against America and the nuclear weapons program. This theory ends with the KGB kidnapping Vladimir because he was going to expose the nuclear winter theory as being untrue, and they wanted to stop that from happening. I feel like they could have found a guy who actually believed in the theory to say he came up with this mathematical model for it, but hey, I'm not a scientist. Unfortunately, it is likely we may never know what exactly happened to him, unless Vladimir himself ends up finding a way to let us know. In our number 1 spot today we have Ettore Majorana. Ettore was an Italian physicist who was born on August 5th, 1906 and disappeared on March 25th, 1938 under some pretty mysterious circumstances. Ettore was very gifted with math from a young age, and when it was time for him to attend university he studied engineering first before making the switch to physics. In 1933 he went to Germany and worked on the theory of the nucleus. In the fall of that same year he returned home to Italy, but he was very sick. While in Germany he developed acute gastritis and was also suffering from nervous exhaustion. He was immediately receiving medical treatment, which included being put on a very strict diet. This whole situation led him to become very isolated, and his reclusive nature only grew and grew over the years. For almost full 4 years he shut himself off completely from friends and wasn't even publishing works. In March of 1938 he boarded a boat from Palermo and was headed to Naples, but he was never seen again. Before he headed to Palermo he apparently withdrew all of his money from his bank account, and it was said that he had traveled there in the first place to visit a friend, but that friend was actually in California at the time. On the day that he disappeared he also sent a letter to his boss that was basically just him quitting his job. And he also sent telegrams canceling any other plans that he had made. Some people believe that he may have taken his own life, others believe he escaped to Venezuela or Argentina, some people believe that he was kidnapped, and honestly the list just goes on. I wonder if we will ever be able to find out what truly happened to him that day.
Starting off this countdown we have Dines Arda. Dines Arda is a Swedish officer that went missing in Stockholm on November 12, 2020. To this day, no one knows what happened to him or where he is, or even if he's still alive. So on the day apparently he told his dad he was going on a 50-mile run, but he never returned home. There is CCTV footage of him leaving the gym, but nothing after that. Army and police searched all over for him for 3 months and still nothing. Theory goes that he was either kidnapped, murdered, took his own life, or ran off for some reason. So basically all the possibilities. But he left behind his phone and IDs, so they honestly don't know what to think. In our 9th spot we have The Imposter, and if you guys are liking this video so far make sure to give it a big thumbs up, you know the drill, because it really helps us out. This one is quite eerie, it literally gave me the creeps. So this story was shared by a woman named Sharon over on Reddit. Sharon's daughter went missing back in 2016. She believes that she was kidnapped. Here's the freaky part. One day a policeman showed up at her door asking about the case, saying that he was assigned to help find her daughter. Sharon invited him in and gave him all the information she knew about her daughter's disappearance. The police officer took detailed notes and then investigated the daughter's room, even taking a bag of her personal belongings, saying that it was necessary for the case. Before leaving, he gave Sharon his card and told her to contact him if she gets any more leads. Now here's the messed up part. Sharon went to contact the number on the card and it said the phone was out of service. She then went to the local police station and asked about this new cop assigned to the case. No one at the station knew who this man was. In the end, it was discovered that the police officer that came to Sharon's house was most likely the man responsible for her daughter's kidnapping. He came in to get some of her personal possessions, but also to see if the mom knew if the police had any leads. That is extremely messed up. Moving on at number 8, we have the ghost police officer. So this story happened back in the late 90s, early 2000s. An officer was out responding to a call of a collision, but when he arrived on scene, there was an officer already there before him. An officer he didn't know. He got out of the car and the two officers did their little introductions. The officer at the scene said his name was Officer Red. Yes, Red, R-E-D. And basically said he could handle it and that the other cop should go. So the officer shook his hand and went back to his car and started driving off. That's when he was radioed asking where he was. He was needed at the scene. So he drove back to the scene, but Officer Red was gone. So he went up to the accident victims and started interviewing them. That's when one of the victims asked him who he was talking to earlier. Apparently they saw him arrive, get out of his car, have a conversation by himself, and then drive away. Yeah, so Officer Red is most likely a ghost. In our 7th spot, we have Officer James. Officer James was a Nevada police officer that worked undercover. On June 25th of 1982, he was out on duty when he disappeared without a trace. He was working undercover getting close to drug dealers. But I guess something went wrong along the way, or they figured out that he was a cop. Either way, James never reported back for a number of days, and that's when the police force began to worry. They knew something bad had happened to him. But to this day, they haven't found James. The very few leads that they had turned out to be dead ends. So sadly, James has never been found, / they don't even know what happened to him. Moving on to number 6, we have the 10 officers. This story involves not only one officer going missing, but 10. So back in June of 2020, 10 officers in Mexico were abducted and went missing. The officers were assigned to provide security for a group of Mexican mining businessmen. That's when an armed group of individuals kidnapped 2 men and 10 officers. When the station lost contact with them, they knew something went wrong and were sent to investigate. For a while, there were no signs of the officers anywhere. That was until authorities received a tip about an abandoned vehicle and a strange odor coming from it. 2 of the 3 unmarked police pickup trucks were found at that location. Inside, they found the body parts of 7 of the missing cops. I honestly don't know what happened to the other 2. This article didn't tell me anything about it, so they could still be missing. We are now at our 5th and halfway mark with the missing policewoman. In 2016, a female officer named Ashwini Bidri went missing. She told her landlord that she was going home for a few days, so he was to let the milkman know that he shouldn't leave any milk out for her. Later that day, she was spotted near FLYNN railway station. That was the last time anyone had seen or heard from her. For 3 months, Ashwini was missing with no solid leads. Those 3 months turned into years. Finally, in 2018, a man was arrested for her disappearance. The man's name was Abhay Karundkar. He was actually the senior inspector that worked with Ashwini. Turns out the two had a thing going on behind the scenes. He apparently took her life, then dumped her body in the creek. Sadly, her body has never been found. Moving on to number 4, we have Inspector V.S. Navis. In 2019, Inspector V.S. Navis went missing after getting in a heated argument. The night before, Navis got in a fight with a senior official. The next day, he was gone without a trace. Now, Navis's wife believes that he fled because of mental torture that he was subjected to at work. He was also repeatedly humiliated at work. It was getting way too much for him, so he left. Now, he was last seen on CCTV footage withdrawing cash from an ATM. His force went out looking for him, but Navis's wife told them to just let him be and have time for himself. In our 3rd spot, we have Stephen Bear. In 2016, Littleton police officer Stephen Bear went climbing at Mount Elbrus. It is the tallest mountain in Europe. On June 12th, Stephen called his wife Olivia and said he arrived safely in Russia. That's the last time she ever spoke to him. Stephen went on his climb and was never seen again. Now, Stephen was climbing this solo, so there was no one else there with him to help him along the way. So we might never know what happened to him on that climb. What's also challenging is that when he was reported missing, there was a huge blizzard. So tracking him down was near impossible. While out looking for him, they did find 2 bodies. But to this day, they still haven't found Stephen. It's honestly a heartbreaking story, like poor Stephen and poor Olivia and her 2 sons. And at number 2, we have Catherine Campbell. In September of 2015, Officer Catherine Campbell went missing without a trace. She was first reported missing when she didn't arrive to work on September 14th. It was very out of character for her to not show up to work. Police then searched her apartment and they found her TV on, her alarm clock ringing, and her cats hungry looking for food. Eventually, police were able to track down Catherine's last movements. CCTV footage showed her at a bar with a man named Christopher Calvin Garner. At the bar, they were seen kissing and talking. They then left together at 3:40 in the morning. That was the last time Catherine was seen alive. CCTV footage of that night revealed Christopher rolling out a green bin down his street in bare feet. A while later, Catherine's body was found. The green bin Christopher was last seen with was found abandoned nearby, and he was caught for her murder. And in our number 1 spot, we have the river diving gone wrong. In January of 2018, a French policewoman went missing while taking part in a training exercise. So on that day, this woman and a bunch of other officers were at a river in Paris. They were doing diving exercises run by the Specialist River Police and firefighters in the French capital. That's when she suddenly disappeared. According to reports, she resurfaced from her dive and then quickly disappeared again. When this happened, colleagues went to look for her, but to no avail. There were 100 firefighters, 17 divers, 20 boats, and 2 helicopters out looking for her. Sadly, she has still never been found. Everyone is shocked at how fast she disappeared, and also how there's no signs of her.